Welcome back, folks, for the second installment of The Rise of Industry, Part 2. I am Miss Jennifer Blank, and I will be your guide on this journey. So today we're talking about the ever-important topic of economics. Because you can't really talk about the Industrial Revolution without some basic economic vocab, okay? So we're going to go over some of that today and some concepts that you're going to see resurface in later lessons. And so without further ado, here we go. So these are the key vocab we're going to talk about. I'm going to talk about all of these things. Some of the slides, I'm just going to have you write down the definitions and we'll go into more detail in class. You just need to have a working knowledge of what they are so you can understand the larger concepts that we're going to talk about. So what is the free market? Let's talk about what that is, because the United States certainly at this time had a free market, okay? So a free market is an economic system where decisions on the three economic questions are based on voluntary exchange. What does that mean? It means that people make choices. You can choose who to work for. You can choose who to sell to. You can choose who to buy from. That your average everyday people, the compilation of all individuals in the market are making these decisions. It's not decided by government. It's not decided by one entity or a small number of entities. It is done by the collective economic choices of everybody involved in the market, okay? Like it says here, the collection of individual choices determines what is available in the market. So basically, effectively, the buyers decide what they're willing to buy. If we're willing to buy it, somebody will produce it. People talk about like, oh, pornography, it's so horrible, it shouldn't exist. Well, if people didn't want it, it wouldn't exist, okay? So things exist because people want them, okay? Market economies are capitalist economies, okay? And what does that mean? Well, basically, it means that individuals and privately owned business own the factors of production, okay? Now, what is a more specific definition? An economic and political system in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit rather than by the state. Again, this is capitalism, and free markets are about freedom of choice. Like I said, you choose who to work for, how much to sell your labor for, you choose what to buy for how much to pay for it. Like if you're not willing to pay for something at a certain price, you don't buy it. Eventually the price has to come down if nobody's buying it or the company goes out of business, that kind of idea. Now, there are other isms that we need to be aware of, and people throw around these isms like they know what they're talking about, and they don't. So, some other isms you will hear throughout the course of this course. Socialism. What is socialism? There are different kinds of socialism, but we're not going to get into that right now, but the basic premise of it is this: a political and economic theory of social organization, which advocates that the means of production, distribution, and exchange should be owned or regulated by the community as a whole. In practice, this winds up being government in most cases. But again, we'll get into that in more detail at a later date. Now, the other ism, what is communism? This is a political theory derived from Karl Marx, advocating a class war and leading to a society in which all property is publicly owned. Each person works and is paid according to their abilities and needs. Sounds like a beautiful system, but there are problems with the system, and we'll get into that. Well, there are problems with the free market too, and we'll get into that, well, right now. So, key terms. I'm not going to read all of these to you. You can pause the video and write these down. You need to have a working knowledge of what these things are. Corporation, stock, entrepreneur. Okay, so pause the video, write this down. This also, pause the video, write this down. Now, trusts is particularly important for this era because trusts were it's one form of monopoly, but it was the primary form of monopoly that is in existence at this point. During the Industrial Revolution. So it's really important to understand what a monopoly is. You understand what a trust is. Trust and monopoly are not equivalent, okay? A trust is a type of monopoly, okay? There are other types. We'll get into that, not now, because sadly, this isn't a course in economics. This is a course in U.S. history, so we're only going to go over the big picture ideas in a very basic way so that we have a working knowledge, so that we can understand the history of what we're talking about. Now, let's talk about how these trusts were organized. There are a couple of different types. There's horizontal integration and vertical integration. Now, Standard Oil, which is one of the biggest trusts, if not the biggest trust of this era that we're going to talk about, Standard Oil had a horizontal integration. Okay, so basically they were in charge of the refining process, and Standard Oil bought up every competitor. They bought out every single competitor and controlled throughout the entire industry every refinery. Every single refinery in the country at one point was controlled by Standard Oil. What this allowed Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller, who was running Standard Oil, what this allowed him to do was dictate prices and terms to all of these other areas of the industry. Because drilling, there's no point in drilling if you can't get it to a refinery, and you can't sell anything until it's been refined. Okay, so basically, Standard Oil could run the table because they controlled this one step in the process. This is a horizontal organization. They controlled every single refinery in the country at one point. Now, Carnegie was a bit different. In the steel industry, he had vertical integration. So he was one-stop shop. You could, Carnegie mined, he transported, he smelted, and he refined and rolled for the steel industry. So this allowed him, because he controlled every step in the process, it allowed him to offer steel for cheaper, okay? And effectively priced out of the market all the other companies that were producing steel. So instead of like Rockefeller just took over every refinery and forced everybody else in the industry to have to work with him on his terms, Carnegie basically put everybody out of business except for himself, for the most part. And that's how his trust worked. He was vertical integration. So there are a couple of different types of trust formation, and these are the two that you need to be aware of. So why do we have markets? Well, we need a place where we can buy and sell things, okay, so that we can get what we want and what we need, okay? This eliminates the need for self-sufficiency, because remember, without a market, make your own clothes, make your own medicine, make your own food, make your own everything. And we're not all good at the same stuff, right? It would be like me teaching all high school classes, like all of them, like chemistry and algebra 2 and English. I mean, God forbid, okay? Like this, you do not want me anywhere near a chemistry class, okay? It's not going to end well, okay? So, but I specialize in history. It's what I'm good at. Chemistry teacher specializes in chemistry. It's what they're good at, right? So this allows for a better product. So eliminating self-sufficiency allows for what I just described, this process of specialization. The idea that you do what you're good at, you do it better, you do it more efficiently, you can do it for cheaper, and then you buy, sell, trade to get the other items that you need, and you do this in a market. So I have some quotes from Adam Smith here, or a quote from Adam Smith, and then some concepts. So, give me that which I want, and you shall have this which you want. It is in this manner that we obtain from one another the far greater part of those goods or services which we stand in need of. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from regard to their own self-interest. Now, if you're a butcher and every time somebody buys meat from you, they get sick, they're going to go to another butcher, right? Because that butcher is not going to stay in business because they're not making a good product. So the idea is it's in corporations and sellers' self-interest to make a good product. Because if they make a bad product, people aren't going to buy from them. They're going to go out of business. So self-interest, according to Adam Smith, the father of capitalism, self-interest is what drives the market. It's what drives the economy. And then there's this idea of incentive, the hope of reward or fear of penalty that encourages a person to behave in a certain way. So if you have a good product, you want to have a good product because you have the reward of money, all right? You also fear the punishment of going out of business. So that incentive is what drives you to make a good product. So these are examples of positive versus negative incentives. Excuse me, pardon me. So positive incentive, higher grades, make it easier for Andre here to get into a good college. Negative incentive, he'll ground him if a grade slump, and a larger scale. State government offers tax credit for commuters. That's a positive incentive. You get something. Negative incentive, state raises gasoline taxes to reduce gasoline consumption, right? So those are just examples of positive and negative incentives. Okay, so this is some key vocab. So self-interest, we talked about. Competition, all right? Incentives drive competition. Now let me make this clear. You cannot have a free market without competition. Competition has to exist in order to have a free market. So while during the Industrial Revolution, we started out as a free market, over time, we became not a free market because there were industries with no competition. Without competition, you can't have a free market because there's no choice. There's only one place to buy from. You don't have choice. Therefore, the market isn't free. You are forced to buy from the only place that's making it. Okay. Now, Adam Smith came up with this idea called the invisible hand. If you have both competition and self-interest, you will have an efficient marketplace. You will have a good, well-run free market. And if that happens, no outside intervention is necessary. Now, as we're going to see here, but also during the progressive era, outside intervention is going to become necessary because of the trusts. Okay, the trusts were removing the free from the market, and government needed to step in to regulate it a bit so that we actually had competition. So these are some advantages of the free market. You have economic efficiency, you have economic freedom, you have economic growth. You also have this idea of consumer sovereignty. Consumers have power to decide what gets produced because if they don't buy it, people stop making it. If they do buy it, people continue to make it. These are some advantages. Now, here are some disadvantages. So equity is not possible. In a free market, you're not going to have equity. It's not possible because it's not about what's fair. It's not about it's not about that. It's about the best product for the best price. That's what it's about. Best product for the best price. So equity is not going to happen. Security is not guaranteed. You're not guaranteed a job. You're not guaranteed the resources you need. You have to find a way to make that yourself. Now, in a pure free market, there's no regulation. Okay. But the United States doesn't have a free market and hasn't a pure free market and hasn't had one for quite some time. We'll talk more about that in class. Now, you also get compromised competition eventually you will get compromised competition, which is what we saw during the Industrial Revolution. And we saw that with, like I mentioned, Carnegie and Rockefeller in steel and oil. You have monopolies. And if there is no competition, there is no invisible hand, like I talked about before. So the name of the game during this era in history was laissez-faire capitalism. Laissez-faire is French for leave it alone, basically. The government should stay out of the economy. The government should not regulate business. This was the driving force during the Industrial Revolution, and it's what led to the trusts that were so damaging to the United States economy. It was a disaster, okay, but we'll get to that. We'll talk more about this in class. But laissez-faire capitalism, you need to know what this is. It's French for leave it alone, and this is what it means. So you have to, I'm telling you right now, memorize this, telling you. Okay, so I talked about Adam Smith a little bit before. He wrote The Wealth of Nations. He is the father of capitalism. Okay, so I talked about this. We don't need to spend a lot of time on that. So there's this myth in America, this pull yourself up by your bootstraps idea. Where does this come from? It comes from this guy, Horatio Alger, okay? And he based this novel on this young man who became rich and successful through honesty, hard work, and just a little bit of luck. Let's be real. That's not how the world works. That's not how it works. This pull yourself up by your bootstraps only works if you actually have a boot with straps, right? If you don't have a boot and you don't have any straps, then how are you going to pull yourself up? Plus, the whole idea, I mean, think about it. If you put shoes on, right, and you pull on the laces, do you rise off the ground? Of course you don't. That's why the whole myth is stupid, and people have co-opted it to make it mean like can do America, grr, you know, and it's complete, it's crap, is what it is. It's ridiculous. And the typical wealthy business person was white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant male who came from upper and middle class background. So nobody's pulling themselves up by anything. It's not. It's a myth. Okay, and unfortunately, it still reigns in popular culture today. But this is where it started. So we do get an expanding middle class. Capitalism did allow for a diversity of social and economic classes. So with the growth of corporations, we needed white-collar workers. So this is where you get the development of middle management positions, the middle management stuff. So this expanded middle class because they created jobs for accountants, clerical workers, salespeople, and so more people were able to move into the middle class with the advent of these jobs. So this was a positive for the expand. Whenever you have a strong expanding middle class, the economy is good. It's an indication that things are going right. When the middle class is shrinking, then you have yourself an economic problem. So most people, however, were wage owners. So two-thirds of workers by 1900 worked for wages that required them to work about 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. These wages were determined by supply and demand. Factory wages were barely above subsistence. There was no regulation at this point. There's no minimum wage that didn't exist. No maximum working day that didn't exist. No minimum working conditions that didn't exist. All of that would come later with the progressive era reforms, which we will talk about in detail once we get to the progressive era. Real wages did rise, but most families still couldn't support a family on one income, so multiple people had to work. This is where you get the advent of child labor. Yes, back then there was no school, there was factory work. So be thankful that you're in school. As much of a drag as it can be sometimes, it's better than working 10 hours a day in a factory. Just saying. So by 1890, women and children were working to make up the difference to support that family. And then by 1890, you have almost 13 million families making less than $380 a year, which is an incredibly tiny, tiny amount. Not enough to live off of. Not live well, anyway. So women were working. Okay, so this idea that like women were always this 1950s, like women never worked and it didn't happen, that's total crap because they were working. That 1950s stereotype is inaccurate. 1 out of every 5, so 20% of women were working in 1900. Most were young and single. Once they had families and things shifted a bit, they had responsibilities of childcare and child rearing. They usually worked in textile, garment, and food processing industries, and they worked as secretaries, bookkeepers, typists, and telephone operators. So working women were going to be really, really important here. And that, folks, ends part 2. I hope you learned what you needed to, and I will see you in the next video.